No, I mean, central banks can always rein in inflation, and this is what they've always known throughout. For a central bank, it's so much easier to take inflation down rather than taking inflation up, which actually they have failed to do in the last 10 years, since inflation has always been below target for such a prolonged period of time. Clearly, you want to do it in a gradual and predictable manner rather than in a rush. And having inflation now reached almost 8% in the US and 6% in Europe, that means that central banks have some catch up to do. In the face of this negative supply shock, clearly there will be a division of labor, I believe, between central banks and governments. Central banks will focus on inflation and governments on support to economic activity, I believe.
Brunello, I like your economic orthodoxy. I've said the same line many times, that central banks like to control inflation rather than worrying about deflation, but they haven't controlled inflation, have they? My problem is, this time round, if they do raise rates in order to offset that threat of longer-term higher inflation, they're going to destroy growth. And they're also a small matter of the world record debt for sovereigns, for corporations, for individuals as well. That's a difference this time round. If they raise rates in order to tame the inflationary beast, the debt profile is going to potentially destroy not only government finances, but also those of companies and individuals, aren't they?
Clearly, there are conflicting objectives there. Central banks need to control inflation, make sure that growth will not collapse. And now they've been asked to monetize the huge amount of debt that has been issued to counter the pandemic and the additional debt that is going to be issued to counter the effects of growth. So they have lots of balls to juggle, and it's not going to be easy to find a path. So how do they come up of this dilemma, policy dilemma, if you want? Well, they have to prioritize among the policy objectives, and in particular, looking at what's the most relevant and immediate threat. And at this stage, it's inflation. People, companies are asking central banks to rein in inflation, and therefore they need to deliver on their mandate. Clearly, they like to be able to reach all the goals that you just mentioned: inflation, growth, financial stability, and also clearly monetization on the debt that has been created. But they only have a couple of instruments, maybe one, at their disposal. And therefore, they will need to prioritize. Hopefully, governments will also come to the rescue at some point.
Brunello, surely the negative impact on the economy is far more significant and policy relevant than any spike in inflation at the moment. And I'm talking about the negative effect from the geopolitical event that's playing out in Europe right now here, because we see Goldman Sachs taking down their growth forecasts. We see all sorts of potential pathways to global recession this year. Is it time to refocus perhaps on the impact of sanctions and the other downstream fat tail risks coming out of this European war?
It's going to be something that central banks and others will have to look at very carefully. But again, look at the numbers now. You got an economy that just prior to the war was rebounding from the pandemic. It's not as good as it was in 2021, but it's still decent numbers, 3, 4, 5% across the board, even the weaker economies, okay? So if you shave off some tenths of a percentage point or even a full percentage point of growth due to the sanctions and potential effects of the war, you will still have a growth rate that is optically acceptable, I would say. Instead, what is not optically acceptable is inflation reaching 8% in the US, 6% in Europe, 7% in the UK. And what's the danger of that? That higher inflation gets entrenched, and then you enter into that wage price spiral that nobody wants to. Are we closer to that? Yes, we are. Look at the strikes that are hitting economies everywhere, in the UK, in Italy, in France, in the US. People are striking because they want better working conditions, higher salaries. With inflation at 8%, 7%, 6%, those salary increases will have to come. And then central banks will have a much harder job in the coming months to rein in inflation. And they will have to increase rates much more aggressively, as Volcker did in the 70s, 80s, to rein in inflation. Nobody wants that. We need a gradual approach, a gradual normalization on the policy, or the monetary policy of central banks, and hopefully governments will do their parts in supporting economic activity.